Why did the age of the Vikings end? Inequality, sex, and Jesus. The Viking era, marked by brutal raids and conquests, was one of the most turbulent and bloody periods in European history. But how did these fearsome warriors, whose very names struck terror across continents, vanish almost overnight? In this video, we will uncover the untold reasons behind the fall of the Vikings and explore the forces that brought their reign of terror to an end. Let's go back in time to one of the most bloody and brutal sagas in Europe and beyond. The Viking Age was a time when longboats carved with dragons would emerge from the fog and savage fighters would pillage entire cities. For over 3 centuries, these Norse warriors dominated the seas, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Yet despite their power and ferocity, the Viking era came to a sudden and dramatic close. What caused this unstoppable force to fade into history? In this video, we'll piece together the story of the Vikings' downfall, drawing on historical accounts, archaeological evidence, and modern interpretations. We'll discover how inequality, the mixing of cultures through sex, and the spread of Christianity played crucial roles in the decline of this once mighty civilization. To understand the end of the Vikings, we must first explore the beginning of their reign. The Viking Age, spanning from approximately 790 CE to 1100 CE, was a period when Norsemen from Scandinavia, modern-day Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland embarked on epic voyages of plunder and conquest. The origin of the word Viking is debated, but it is generally believed to derive from the Old Norse word viking, meaning pirate or raider. Not all Scandinavians were Vikings. Only those who took part in raiding expeditions were given this title. The Vikings were both men and women, driven by a desire for wealth, adventure, and glory. Their longships, masterfully crafted for speed and agility, allowed them to travel vast distances across treacherous seas, reaching as far as Russia and Constantinople. The story of the Vikings begins not in the fjords of Scandinavia, but on the shores of distant lands, where their arrival was often heralded by the fearsome sight of longships emerging from the mist. These ships, with their shallow drafts and double-ended designs, were not only capable of swift ocean voyages, but could also navigate shallow rivers, allowing the Vikings to penetrate deep into the heart of Europe. The first recorded Viking raid occurred on June 8, 793, when they attacked the St. Cuthbert Church at Lindisfarne in Northumbria, England. This event sent shockwaves across Europe, marking the beginning of an era of terror. The Vikings did not discriminate in their choice of targets. Monasteries, towns, and even entire kingdoms were at risk of their wrath. What made the Vikings particularly terrifying was their unpredictability. Unlike the structured armies of the time, the Vikings could appear anywhere, at any time, striking with a ferocity that left their victims stunned and helpless. Their raids were not just about plunder. They were about asserting dominance, instilling fear, and securing their place in the world as a force to be reckoned with. But the story of the Vikings is not just one of violence and conquest. It is also a story of exploration, trade, and cultural exchange. As the Viking Age progressed, these Norse warriors began to establish settlements in the lands they had once raided, leading to a blending of cultures and a transformation of Viking society. As the Viking raids intensified, they targeted not only the British Isles, but also the continent. Francia, modern-day France and Germany, became a prime target due to its internal turmoil. The Vikings launched massive assaults on cities, monasteries, and coastal towns, driven by the lure of gold, silver, and slaves. The raid on Paris in 845, led by the legendary Viking chieftain Ragnar Lothbrok, exemplifies the brutality and cunning of these Norse warriors. Ragnar's forces, numbering in the thousands, sailed up the Seine River and laid siege to Paris, demanding an enormous ransom to spare the city. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, was forced to pay 7,000 French livres, 2,570 kilograms of gold and silver, to secure the Vikings' departure. Despite such victories, the Vikings faced growing resistance as European rulers fortified their cities and organized defenses. The impact of the Viking raids on Europe was profound. They disrupted trade, weakened kingdoms, and caused widespread fear and panic. But they also spurred a response that would ultimately contribute to the decline of the Viking way of life. As the Viking threat grew, European rulers began to build stronger defenses, such as fortified towns and castles, to protect their people from the Norsemen's attacks. These defenses made it increasingly difficult for the Vikings to raid successfully, forcing them to adapt their strategies or seek out weaker targets. The Viking raids also had a significant impact on the development of European society. The need to defend against the Vikings led to the centralization of power in many regions, as local lords and kings sought to consolidate their resources to protect their lands. This centralization of power contributed to the development of the feudal system, which would shape European society for centuries to come. Additionally, the Vikings' reputation as fierce warriors and skilled sailors led to their recruitment as mercenaries and allies by various European rulers. This integration of Vikings into European society further diluted their distinct cultural identity and contributed to their eventual assimilation. However, the Vikings were not merely raiders, they were also skilled traders and explorers. Their raids often served as a precursor to trade, as the Norsemen established trading networks that stretched from the Middle East to North America. The Vikings played a crucial role in connecting different cultures and economies, bringing goods, ideas, and technologies from one region to another. This exchange of goods and ideas enriched both Viking and European societies, but it also led to the gradual erosion of the Viking way of life as they became more integrated into the wider European world. While the Vikings were feared across Europe, their dominance began to wane due to a combination of internal and external factors. By the mid-9th century, the Viking way of life was under threat. Within Scandinavia, power was becoming more centralized, and the once egalitarian society was shifting towards a more hierarchical structure. This centralization meant that Vikings were no longer free to raid at will. Instead, they had to align with the interests of powerful chieftains and kings. As Scandinavian society evolved, so too did its priorities. The growth of permanent settlements, such as Dublin and York, signaled a shift from raiding to trading and farming. Vikings began to integrate with local populations, marrying and having children, which diluted their distinct cultural identity. This process of integration, along with the spread of Christianity, which preached values antithetical to the Viking ethos of plunder and conquest, further weakened their resolve. One of the most significant internal pressures on the Viking way of life was the shift in Scandinavian society from a warrior culture to a more settled and agrarian one. As the Viking Age progressed, the need for land and resources became increasingly important. The establishment of permanent settlements in newly conquered territories meant that many Vikings were now more concerned with defending their lands and growing crops than with raiding distant shores. This shift in focus from raiding to farming and trade fundamentally changed the nature of Viking society. As power became more centralized in Scandinavia, the role of the individual Viking warrior also changed. In the early Viking Age, a warrior's status and wealth were determined by his success in raiding and plundering. However, as the Scandinavian chieftains and kings consolidated power, they began to control the distribution of wealth and resources. This shift in power dynamics meant that individual warriors were now more dependent on their leaders for land and wealth, which in turn reduced their autonomy and freedom to raid independently. The external pressures on the Vikings also played a significant role in their decline. As mentioned earlier, the growing resistance from European rulers made it increasingly difficult for the Vikings to raid successfully. The construction of fortified towns and castles, as well as the development of more organized and powerful armies, meant that the Vikings were now facing opponents who were better prepared and equipped to defend against their attacks. Additionally, the spread of Christianity throughout Europe, including in Scandinavia, also contributed to the decline of the Viking way of life. Christianity preached values such as peace, charity, and loving thy neighbor, which were in direct opposition to the Viking ethos of raiding and plundering. As more Scandinavians converted to Christianity, the cultural and religious foundations of the Viking way of life were eroded. Christianity played a pivotal role in the decline of the Vikings. As the religion spread across Europe, it eventually reached the shores of Scandinavia. Initially, the Vikings had little interest in adopting Christianity, viewing it as a foreign belief system that clashed with their own Norse mythology. However, as more Norsemen came into contact with Christian communities, or whether through trade, conquest, or defeat, the influence of Christianity grew. Missionaries ventured into the Viking homelands, converting the Scandinavian elite and eventually the broader population. The new Christian kings of Scandinavia began to impose their religion on their subjects, eradicating the pagan practices that had defined Viking culture for centuries. The moral values of Christianity, which emphasized peace, charity, and loving thy neighbor, were incompatible with the Viking way of life. As Christianity took hold, the warrior ethos that had fueled the Viking raids was gradually extinguished. The transformation was so profound that by the late 11th century, the Viking identity had all but vanished, replaced by a Christian Scandinavian society that was more interested in building churches than longships. The spread of Christianity in Scandinavia was not just a religious transformation. It was a cultural and societal revolution. The adoption of Christianity by the Scandinavian elite marked a significant shift in the power dynamics of the region. The Christian kings of Scandinavia saw the new religion as a means of consolidating their power and legitimizing their rule. By aligning themselves with the Christian church, these kings were able to assert their authority over their subjects and bring the independent and often rebellious Viking chieftains under their control. The Christianization of Scandinavia also had a profound impact on the legal and social structures of Viking society. The introduction of Christian laws and customs replaced the Old Norse legal system, which was based on oral tradition and communal decision-making. The new Christian legal system was more centralized and hierarchical, reflecting the power structures of the Christian church and the emerging Scandinavian monarchies. This shift in legal and social structures further eroded the traditional Viking way of life, which had been based on communal ties and mutual obligations. Another significant aspect of the Christianization of Scandinavia was the construction of churches and monasteries. These buildings not only served as places of worship, but also as centers of education, administration, and cultural exchange. The spread of Christian education and literacy in Scandinavia contributed to the decline of the oral tradition that had been central to Viking culture. The Christian church also played a crucial role in the preservation and transmission of knowledge, as many of the Old Norse myths and legends were written down by Christian scribes. However, this process of recording the old stories also involved their reinterpretation and adaptation to fit Christian values and beliefs, which further diluted the Viking cultural heritage. The decline of the Viking way of life was not an abrupt event, but rather a gradual process of transformation and assimilation. As Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia, the Old Norse gods and traditions were replaced by the new Christian faith. This process of religious and cultural assimilation was further accelerated by the integration of Scandinavian society into the broader Christian European world. By the end of the Viking Age, the once fearsome Norse warriors had become part of a larger Christian civilization, their distinct identity as Vikings gradually fading into history. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 is often cited as the event that marked the official end of the Viking Age. Harald Hardrada, one of the last great Viking kings, launched an invasion of England with a formidable force, hoping to claim the English throne. However, his campaign ended in disaster when he was defeated and killed by the forces of King Harold Godwinson. This battle was a turning point, signaling the end of the Viking threat to Europe. After Stamford Bridge, Viking raids became increasingly rare, and the once feared Norsemen faded into history. The defeat at Stamford Bridge was not just a military loss, but a symbolic end to an era. The Viking Age, characterized by fierce warriors and daring raids, gave way to a new era of centralized kingdoms and organized religion. The world had changed, and the Vikings, who had once been at the forefront of that change, were now relics of a bygone era. But while the Vikings themselves disappeared, their legacy lived on. The Scandinavian culture they spread across Europe during their raids and conquests left an indelible mark on the continent, influencing everything from architecture and language to military tactics and trade. The Battle of Stamford Bridge is often regarded as one of the most decisive battles in the history of England, and it played a crucial role in shaping the future of both England and Scandinavia. Harold Hardrada, known as the last of the Vikings, was a seasoned warrior and a legendary figure in Norse history. His ambition to claim the English throne was rooted in a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and dynastic claims that had been brewing for decades. Hardrada's invasion of England was not just a military campaign. It was a last-ditch effort to revive the Viking spirit and assert Norse dominance over Europe once more. The events leading up to the Battle of Stamford Bridge were marked by a series of strategic moves and counter-moves by both the Vikings and the English. Hardrada's forces, numbering between 10,000 and 15,000 men, sailed across the North Sea and landed in Yorkshire. They were joined by Tostig Godwinson, the rebellious brother of King Harold Godwinson of England, who sought to overthrow his brother with Hardrada's help. Together they marched south, raiding and pillaging as they went, until they reached the outskirts of York. The English response to the Viking invasion was swift and decisive. King Harold Godwinson, who had been preparing to defend against a potential invasion by William of Normandy in the south, quickly redirected his forces north to confront the Viking threat. The two armies met at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, in what would become one of the most famous battles in English history. The battle itself was a brutal and bloody affair, with both sides fighting fiercely for control. The Vikings, exhausted from their long march and previous battles, were caught off guard by the speed and determination of the English forces. Despite their reputation as fierce warriors, the Vikings were unable to withstand the relentless assault of the English army. Harold Hardrada, who had fought valiantly throughout the battle, was struck down by an arrow to the throat, marking the end of the Viking Age. The significance of the Battle of Stamford Bridge cannot be overstated. It marked the end of the Viking invasions of England and the beginning of a new era in European history. The defeat of Harold Hardrada symbolized the end of the Viking way of life and the rise of centralized kingdoms and organized religion in Scandinavia. The world had changed, and the Vikings, who had once been at the forefront of that change, were now relics of a bygone era. However, the legacy of the Vikings would continue to shape European history for centuries to come. The Scandinavian culture that they had spread across Europe during their raids and conquests left an indelible mark on the continent. The Viking influence can be seen in everything from the architecture of medieval castles and churches to the development of trade routes and the spread of language and literature. The Viking spirit of exploration, adventure, and resilience also lived on, inspiring future generations of explorers and adventurers to push the boundaries of the known world. The Battle of Stamford Bridge may have marked the end of the Viking Age, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in European history. The Vikings may have faded into history, but their legacy continues to live on, shaping the world we live in today. One of the less discussed but equally significant factors in the decline of the Vikings was the role of sex and intermarriage with local populations. As the Vikings settled in the lands they had once raided, they began to integrate with the local communities. This integration was not just cultural or economic, it was also biological. Viking men, who had once been fearsome warriors, began to marry local women, and these unions produced offspring who were no longer purely Viking. Over time, the distinct Viking identity began to fade as these mixed heritage families became more integrated into the local culture. The process of intermarriage and integration was not unique to the Vikings. It was a common phenomenon throughout history as conquering peoples settled in new lands. However, in the case of the Vikings, this process had a particularly profound impact on their cultural identity. The Viking way of life, which had been centered around raiding and warfare, was gradually replaced by a more settled and agrarian lifestyle. The warrior ethos that had defined the Vikings for centuries was diluted as they became more involved in farming, trading, and raising families. The children of these mixed marriages were raised in a world that was increasingly influenced by local customs and traditions. They grew up speaking the local language, practicing the local religion, and following the local laws. While they may have still identified as Vikings, their connection to the Old Norse traditions and values was weakened. This process of cultural assimilation was further accelerated by the spread of Christianity, which promoted monogamy, family life, and settled communities, all of which were at odds with the traditional Viking way of life. The role of sex and intermarriage in the decline of the Vikings can also be seen in the changing gender dynamics within Viking society. In the early Viking Age, women played a significant role in society, both as warriors and as the keepers of the household. However, as Viking society became more settled and Christianized, the roles of women became more restricted. The Christian Church promoted a more patriarchal social structure, where women were expected to be obedient wives and mothers, and their involvement in public life was limited. This shift in gender roles further eroded the traditional Viking way of life. The warrior women, or shield maidens, who had once fought alongside their male counterparts, were now expected to conform to the Christian ideal of womanhood. This change in gender dynamics not only diminished the role of women in Viking society, but also weakened the overall warrior culture that had defined the Vikings for so long. In conclusion, the role of sex and intermarriage in the decline of the Vikings was a complex and multifaceted process. It involved the gradual assimilation of Viking culture into the local populations they had once conquered, the changing gender dynamics within Viking society, and the influence of Christianity on family life and social structures. Together, these factors contributed to the eventual disappearance of the distinct Viking identity and the integration of the Norse people into the broader European world. The transformation of Viking identity was not an abrupt event, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries. As the Vikings settled in new lands and integrated with local populations, their distinct cultural identity began to evolve. This transformation was influenced by a variety of factors, including the spread of Christianity, the shift from a warrior culture to a more agrarian society, and the role of intermarriage and cultural assimilation. One of the key aspects of this transformation was the changing nature of Viking warfare. In the early Viking Age, warfare was central to Viking identity. Raiding and plundering were not just means of acquiring wealth, they were also ways of asserting dominance and gaining honor. The Viking warrior was a symbol of strength, courage, and independence. However, as Viking society became more settled, the nature of warfare changed. The large-scale raids of the early Viking Age gave way to more organized and strategic military campaigns. These campaigns were often led by powerful chieftains and kings who sought to expand their territories and consolidate their power. As warfare became more organized and controlled by central authorities, the role of the individual warrior diminished. The focus shifted from personal honor and glory to loyalty to the king or chieftain. This shift in focus had a profound impact on Viking identity, as the traditional values of independence and self-reliance were replaced by a more hierarchical and centralized social structure. The spread of Christianity also played a significant role in the transformation of Viking identity. As more Scandinavians converted to Christianity, the Old Norse gods and traditions were gradually replaced by the new Christian faith. This religious transformation had a profound impact on Viking culture and identity. The Christian Church promoted values such as humility, obedience, and charity. which were in stark contrast to the traditional Viking values of honor, strength, and independence. The Christianization of Scandinavia also led to the construction of churches and monasteries, which became centers of education, administration, and cultural exchange. The spread of Christian education and literacy contributed to the decline of the oral tradition that had been central to Viking culture. The Old Norse myths and legends were written down by Christian scribes, but they were often reinterpreted and adapted to fit Christian values and beliefs. This process of recording and reinterpreting the old stories further diluted the Viking cultural heritage and contributed to the transformation of Viking identity. The role of intermarriage and cultural assimilation in the transformation of Viking identity cannot be overstated. As the Vikings settled in new lands and married local women, their distinct cultural identity began to blend with the local cultures. The children of these mixed marriages were raised in a world that was increasingly influenced by local customs and traditions. They grew up speaking the local language, practicing the local religion, and following the local laws. While they may have still identified as Vikings, their connection to the Old Norse traditions and values was weakened. The process of cultural assimilation was further accelerated by the spread of Christianity, which promoted monogamy, family life, and settled communities, all of which were at odds with the traditional Viking way of life. The Christian Church also promoted a more patriarchal social structure, where women were expected to be obedient wives and mothers, and their involvement in public life was limited. This shift in gender roles further eroded the traditional Viking way of life and contributed to the transformation of Viking identity. In conclusion, the transformation of Viking identity was a complex and multifaceted process that involved the gradual assimilation of Viking culture into the local populations they had once conquered, the changing nature of warfare, the spread of Christianity, and the role of intermarriage and cultural assimilation. Together, these factors contributed to the eventual disappearance of the distinct Viking identity and the integration of the Norse people into the broader European world. The Viking Age may have ended over 1,000 years ago, but its impact can still be felt today. The Norsemen who once terrorized Europe left behind a legacy of exploration, trade, and cultural exchange. They were not just warriors, but also settlers, traders and builders who helped shape the medieval world. The fall of the Vikings was not the result of a single event, but rather a complex interplay of factors: internal changes in Scandinavian society, the spread of Christianity, and the growing resistance of their enemies. The role of sex and intermarriage, in particular, played a crucial part in the gradual transformation and eventual disappearance of the Viking way of life. Today, we remember the Vikings not just as raiders, but as a people who played a crucial role in the history of Europe. Their influence can be seen in everything from the architecture of medieval castles and churches to the development of trade routes and the spread of language and literature. The Viking spirit of exploration, adventure, and resilience continues to inspire people around the world. As we reflect on the end of the Viking era, we can see how their story is a reminder of the impermanence of power and the inevitability of change. The Vikings may have disappeared, but their legacy lives on in the cultures and societies they influenced. The blending of Viking and local cultures through intermarriage, the spread of Christianity, and the transformation of social and gender roles all contributed to the gradual assimilation of the Norse people into the broader European world. The Viking Age was a time of great change and transformation, not just for the Vikings themselves, but for the entire European continent. It was a time when old traditions were challenged, new ideas were embraced, and the foundations of modern European society were laid. The legacy of the Vikings is a testament to the power of cultural exchange, the resilience of human societies, and the enduring impact of history on the present. Thank you for watching this video. See you next time.